and welcome to the channel Gavaxman Spin. So today's video is the review video, first review video I've actually done of the latest album by the Manic Street Preachers. So we had a look at the back catalogue and a ranking of the 14 albums that came before this one. Then did an unboxing for this very nice Blood Records edition, which is very cool. And then I've spent the week really listening to the album, and here is the verdict. So is it any good? So in terms of how I'm going to do this, I'm kind of going to try and do the old what do they call it, the shit sandwich. So we'll start with some positives, we'll then maybe look at some negatives, but maybe finish with my favourite kind of tracks from the album. So so the positives, well, I think a band of this heritage that have been going since the late 80s with their first EP, and then the first album was 92. The fact that all these years later they're still making new music, I think they have to be applauded for that, because a lot of bands reach a certain kind of stage in their career where almost inertia, second guessing can set in, and they go one of two ways. They can do an REM, actually that album's behind me, that they got to a point where I think they felt the world really wasn't listening anymore and just called it a day, quite quietly and dignified. You could go the U2 way, where they appear to be completely inert, and the last couple of albums have taken an age to come out, have had multiple producers, and the last thing they managed to put out was just a covering their own kind of songs, you know, with 40 versions of old, you know, U2 tracks redone, and they seem totally kind of bankrupt, whereas the Manics are still going. So that, I think you have to applaud them for that. Is there a theme to this album? I had high hopes when this was announced. The first single, Decline and Fall, kind of gave you an idea that maybe this could be a good one. I thought the using the original Generation Terrorist font gave you kind of an idea of going full circle. And I kind of had high hopes this might be a last rallying cry. Sadly, it isn't that album. It isn't what I kind of hoped for. And in terms of where I would place it, is it, when I did my ranking, the bottom two were this one and that one. So that was 14, that was 13. So is it better than the 14th album? Yes. So it's better than this one. Is it better than the last album, which is Ultra Vivid Lament? Slightly. So for me, it ranks a little bit above the last two, but that's as high as it would go after a week, and I don't think it's going to get any higher. So I've kind of told you where it am. So if I tell you what I think is the big problem this album has, the opening track is sung by Nicky Wire, who's the bass player. So in football terms, that's a little bit like putting Eric Haaland in goal. You've got one of the great rock singers in James Dean Bradfield, and of the 12 tracks on this album, 3 are sung by Nicky Wire. And it reminds me a little bit, this album, of Know Your Enemy, which was a similar album in terms of Nicky Wire's vocal kind of performances were that was, I think, the first album he sang on. And he hasn't got a great voice. Occasionally, the music fits that voice. I think William's last words on Journal from Plague Lovers, he does a great vocal on that because of the vulnerability there. But on this album, the vocals that Nicky contributes, I don't think really add anything to the album. What they do is they kind of change the mood of the album, and that's another kind of problem. So the album opens with a track called Critical Thinking, the title track, and it closes with One Man Militia. So they're both Nicky Wire sung vocals, and they're two tracks that musically do not fit the rest of the album. It feels a little bit like they wanted to start with something a bit aggressive, go out with something a bit aggressive, and And why have they done that? Because the rest of the material doesn't really match that, and it is almost, did they feel the album was a little bit bland and they needed something to kind of, you know, give it a nudge. Unfortunately, it kind of wrong foots the album, because the first track doesn't really fit the rest of what follows, and it goes out with a bit of a whimper in terms of they're kind of sub clashy is the phrase we use. I think something like the Magnificent Seven by the Clash, where they try to incorporate disco elements and funk elements and stuff like that, and they're not really like that, but they're a slightly more aggressive kind of mood, and they just, personally, I don't think they work. The big problem I have with them is lyrically, and there's the next track I'm going to talk about is got some really clunky lyrics, but Critical Thinking, One Man Militia are almost angry cries from a middle-aged man about the state of the world. So there's a line in there about, I'm sick of self-censorship, and I assume they're referring a little bit to cancel culture and things like that. So the Manics, when they started, were a band that were not afraid to dish out some fairly controversial opinions on things like shoegaze. There's the infamous on-stage quotes where they wished certain people would die of AIDS. The Glastonbury appearance where they said it should all be levelled and turned into a motorway, that type of stuff. So they weren't afraid in their youth to kind of give it some in interviews, and I think that helped them in a way, because it certainly made their brand, if that's what you want to call it, a little bit notorious. And of course, when they lost Richie Edwards, I think it kind of crashed all of that down, and that is something they probably had to deal with forevermore. But yeah, so you've got two tracks that kind of thematically rail against the state of the world now, without really sticking it to any kind of individual. And given the times that we're currently living in politically, particularly what's happening in America and stuff, you'd think that maybe they'd have something to say on that. But instead, despite them saying that they're sick of self-censorship and that kind of message, they then choose to do a track called Dear Stephen, which is effectively a bit of an open letter to Morrissey, suggesting that he should be the person he once was, and repentance will gain forgiveness. Which, if you see where I'm going here, it's a complete opposite of what they're saying on Critical Thinking and One Man Militia, where they're decrying self-censorship and not being able to be the people they were, but then expect another artist to morph back to 1985 and be Cuddly Morrissey, where his politics chimed with the Guardian, anti-monarchy, anti-meat industry. That Morrissey's okay, come back and be that one, we'll forgive you, we don't like the current Morrissey, even though two of the tracks on this album talk about not being able to be the people you were. Can you see, it doesn't quite work for me. So I think that lyric, Dear Stephen, it's a shame because the music's okay, but it's a really clunky, rubbish lyric personally, and it's slightly hypocritical of a band that made their own name under controversy to kind of try and guilt trip somebody else into being the person they were. Morrissey and the Smiths are always going to be more culturally significant than the Manic Street Preachers. That's just the way it is. Now, so that's the kind of negative. The opening and closing track, that one clunky thing, do drag this album down, because the problem with the rest of the music is it's nice, it's pleasant, but it hasn't got much bite to it, which is why I think they've gone with those opening and closing tracks, but it doesn't quite work then as an album. And this is a proper album. It's two 6-track sides. It's one to be listened to. No lyric sheet in here, because I don't think the lyrics are up to much on this album. So that's the kind of negative. However, it's not all negative. There are some good stuff in here. So when I listened to side 1, initially I was really concerned because I thought side 1 was weak. I listened to side 2 and I thought, oh, actually that side 2 is better. And then I went straight back and re-listened to side 1 a couple of times. And part of the problem I had with side 1 is a few of the better tracks I was quite familiar with, because they've been kind of previewed already. So Decline and Fall, it was the first song they looked, and actually that's a decent kind of, in the old days it would have been a single probably, wouldn't it? But you don't get them anymore. And I really like People Ruin Buildings. That's a nice, sorry, People Ruin Paintings. That's a really nice, it's a terrible word to use, but it's a nice acoustic-y track, and it kind of works really well, that one, and I do think that's an interesting lyric. The good news is when you flip the album over to side 2, I think the strongest tracks are on that one. So Being Baptized is the opener on side 2. That's a really, really good song. Lovely guitar lines, really well sung and played. That's a good one. And My Brave Friend, we're not quite sure what the subject matter of that is. It feels like a little nod to Richie, but I read online it was actually written in something like 2001, but it's a really good song. That's possibly the best track on the album. The other one that's a contender for best track on the album is Deleted Scenes. That's a really, really good song. But in terms of side 2, the only track that I think is a misstep is the closer. One Man Militia, short track. It kind of doesn't fit the rest of that side. So yeah, so unfortunately, as albums go, if we were doing the old, 5 stars, what would it come? It would probably come somewhere in the 3 out of 5. It's not a late career masterpiece. It hasn't really got any definitive theme. It's not got the kind of post Journal for Plague Lovers kind of thing where some albums had a thing. So Rewind the Film's very acoustic driven, and that was the sonics of that album. Futurology had that electronic kind of sound. I think since then the Manics are kind of meandering a little bit, and this album unfortunately continues that. They try to do a couple of things different at top and tail, but I think allowing Nicky Wire to sing those tracks, I think actually spoils the album actually a little bit. They don't quite work. It's a bit uneven, and they set it off on the wrong kind of foot and they close it on the wrong foot. Part of the problem is though what's in between is pleasant, but it doesn't really have any highs. So in terms of, I compared this to Know Your Enemy, what this hasn't got is some of the lows of that album, but it unfortunately hasn't got the highs. So it hasn't got a Found That Soul, it hasn't got Let Robeson Sing, or it hasn't got a standout kind of track on it. It's a decent album. I'm glad they made it. Is it one I would recommend to fans of the Manics that maybe have given up on them a little bit? I've got quite a few friends who are massive Manic Street Preachers fans from the very, very early days, far bigger fans than I was. You know, seen them live several times, bought the T-shirt, read the book, that type of stuff. But they all kind of, as the years have gone by, have got off that bus. A lot of them, after Plague Lovers, I think they found that their output since then has not been to their taste. I personally, I think Futurology is the last really, really good Essential Manics albums. The last 3 now have kind of started to drift a little bit, but it's pleasant enough. Side 2 is infinitely better than side 1, and if you were going to make a little playlist, if you cut off the opener and closer, you've probably got a nice kind of 10-track album, but there's a couple of wrong foots on there, and it does have, I think, a really clunky, slightly condescending lyric in that Dear Stephen song. I don't think that one works at all. I'm not quite sure what they were going for then, but it's neither a fan homage or a kind of criticism. It kind of just is a bit annoying, to be honest with you. So so sadly I would love to have said something a lot more positive about this album. I'm not a musician. I haven't created music. I've got a guitar and all I do is make a lot of out-of-tune din on it, but it's okay. It's a 3 out of 5. It's no classic, unfortunately, and I'm quite sad to say that. But on the positive, there are some good tracks on here that are pleasant enough, particularly the side 2 tracks, Being Baptized, My Brave Friend and Deleted Scenes. Those 3 are really good tracks. And it's another one to the canon. I applaud them for still going. And who knows, album 16, if there is one, that fire might come back. But sadly, it's not quite there on this one. Thanks for watching. I'll do the usual, like and subscribing. If you have bought this album and you're a Manics fan, tell me what you think. I'm quite happy for people to disagree with me or agree. But let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.